Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session on transitioning from 7 mode to cluster mode. We are expecting a few more people, but I think in the interest of fairness, as you guys have all managed to come on, that we will make a start. So, just to make you aware, my name is Peter Green. I'm a full-time instructor for Fastlane. And this session is just looking at an overview of transitioning from data ONTAP 7 mode to a cluster mode. So we're going to look at the 7 stages of transitioning, from discovering your environment, defining the scope, plan the transition, design your cluster, deploy and configure, migrate the data, and then update your environment. And we're going to look at the aspects that go around this, to give you an insight as to a transitioning process. So why do we need to transition from 7 mode to cluster mode? Well, 7 mode is NetApp's flagship for many years, but over the last few years, NetApp has been proactively pushing for cluster mode. And the reason behind that is that with cluster mode, you have a lot more stability, and there's a lot more flexibility without the worry of, if something goes wrong, am I going to lose out on all my data, either by connectivity, by data loss, or even corruption? And what we're going to look at is how to get from 7 mode across to cluster mode. Unfortunately, there isn't a straightforward, simple upgrade where you just take a 7 mode system and upgrade it to cluster mode. There's a transition process that's required. So the difference between the two is that with 7 mode, you typically have a single controller, or you may have a dual controller environment working as a HA pair. And that may be local or maybe extended over distance using Metro Cluster. But either way, with the 7 mode, the controller is responsible for the data that sits on it. So you have very little flexibility with it and very little manipulation. But when we look at cluster mode, we've now moved from a single controller or even a HA pair to now you can extend up to 12 HA pairs which all work together, which breaks away from the relationship of the data being on a specific hardware or in controller, and it allows you to migrate or move data from one controller to another to distribute workload better, to add more flexibility. It may be down to capacity planning. It just gives you a lot more flexibility. So I've tried to work out an analogy between 7 mode and cluster mode. And what I've come up with is that with 7 mode, with a single controller, it's like riding a unicycle. So it's going to get you from A to B. And, you know, as long as you know what you're doing and with a bit of practice, you can get there. And it will do the job they want it to do of getting you from A to B. But it's very prone to problems in that you've only got the one wheel or the one controller. And if that drops or fails, then you're stuck. So with a lot of customers, they move from a single controller to a HA pair. When you move to a HA pair, it's now like riding a tandem bicycle. You've now got 2 engines that work together and will look after each other. So if one engine fails or one controller fails, then the second controller takes over and acts a bit like a schizophrenic environment. It's a lot more tolerant to problems. There's more of a comfort factor with the HA pair, in that you know that if one controller fails, the other guy is going to take over and keep you up and running. But it still has a lot of restrictions. Each controller in normal working mode is still responsible for its own data. And there's very little flexibility around that. But then when we move to cluster mode, we're essentially changing to be driving an Arctic lorry. So it's going to take a bit of training to understand how to drive that lorry properly. But now, instead of being restricted to the 1 wheel or the 2 wheels, we've now got up to 24 wheels working together. We can distribute the workload anywhere across the cluster. It doesn't matter where the data is physically residing, we have access to it either directly to the owning controller or node, or we've got access to it via another node, and we'll use the cluster interconnect to link between one node and another. Gives us a lot more flexibility and a lot more stability and reliability. It is possible to lose multiple controllers throughout a clustered environment without the fear of losing data or access to the data. It does take a bit of configuration and a bit of planning, but there are ways of actually manipulating the system in such a way that you have a lot of resilience no matter what the circumstances. So when we're looking to move from 7 mode to cluster mode, we typically use the transition fundamentals framework. And this framework takes a very methodical approach to take a 7-mode environment and transition it to the clustered ONTAP. And the whole transition begins once you decide to adopt a clustered ONTAP and move your data away from your existing 7-mode. So when we look at this journey to cluster mode, at the original start, you'll be running 7-mode, and then the idea is that you do an evaluation. Do I need to move to cluster mode? And if I do, how am I going to get there? But there are certain circumstances where cluster mode may not be what you're after or what you require. It's all about making sure that you have what you need to accomplish the task that you need to accomplish. But on the basis that 7-mode is no longer being developed, and all the development work is now going into cluster mode, there's more functionality, more flexibility with a clustered environment than you'll ever have in 7-mode. And as such, the push from NetApp is for you to move across to cluster mode. Now, obviously, there are implications in regards to cost. You know, it does require additional controllers. It does require additional cooling and power. But aside from that, what you actually get is a far more stable environment. So we'll make the assumption that you've done an evaluation and you think, yeah, we need to move to cluster mode because cluster mode will give us a lot more stability and everything else. So then we take on the adoption part. And the adoption is where we look at the transition fundamentals. Once we've gone through the transition fundamentals and we've worked our way through it, you'll end up with your data running in a clustered ONTAP environment. And we're going to look at this transition fundamentals in the next part. So, as an overview, you have 3 main areas. You have the identify, and this is related to addressing the initial business decisions that will drive the identification of which storage containers will transition first in the NetApp environment. Identifying involves understanding what applications and workloads are deployed in your 7-mode environment, and how can you group systems, applications, or workloads together so that they can be moved together and the movement can be prioritized according to the business requirements. And then we have the design stage. And the design stage, we do a category which involves addressing the significant planning activities that are related to the transition. It also includes performance-detailed cluster architecture design on your destination cluster, and transition planning, which encompasses a detailed discovery of your 7-mode environment and your migration planning. And then we look at the cluster architect design, which involves the planning of what cluster capabilities are required to support the migrated workload. And it should also take into account the future growth needs of your storage system. So we've done the identify, we've done the design, and then we need to look at the implementation. So the implement category addresses the activities that involve with the deployment and configuration of the destination cluster, the migration of workflows and data from 7-mode clusters data ONTAP, and the updates to the operating environment to make sure the NetApp environment and all technologies that are dependent on it are working as expected. We have to remember, as part of this process, that there are certain things in 7-mode which, although we can do it in cluster mode, they act and work slightly differently, and we need to accommodate that. For the most part, those differences are advantageous, but we do need to be aware that there are certain things that are slightly different, and how those differences are going to impact what we have to what we're going to end up with. So, as a conceptual framework, you may have your own workflows and processes that you want to implement. NetApp and its partners offer a unified transition methodology when delivering transition-related services to customers. And the transition activities tend to be iterative. There is a web-based training on the introduction to the Unified Transition Methodology Framework, which gives you an outline of the process within this framework concept. So as part of the transition, there are certain tools available from NetApp. The first one is the 7-mode transition tool, or the 7MTT, which assists in the source discovery so you can understand what you've currently got and how it's set up. Helps to automate your data migration from the 7-mode to the cluster mode environment, and is primarily based around the NFS or SIF or SMB migration. The 7-mode transition tool version number 2 also, on top of what the 7-mode tool gives you, also incorporates SAN migration and also metro cluster migration from 7-mode. It wasn't until ONTAP 8.3 that we introduced metro cluster for clusters. So if you're not doing going up to ONTAP 8.3 cluster mode, then there's no transition available for you. But as of 8.3, using the 7-mode transition tool version 2, you can do the metro cluster migration from 7-mode to cluster mode, and it works very well. So there's several types of migration methods that are available, each with their own benefits and considerations, and NetApp has categorized these migration methods based on their benefits and capabilities. So you've got the replication-based migration, and this migration method uses NetApp SnapMirror technology, and this method is available through the 7-mode transition tool, or you can manually transition by creating a SnapMirror relationship of the type TDP, or Transition Data Protection. And the key benefits of replication migration is that the snapshot copies and the storage efficiency savings are retained throughout the migration action. You then have application-based migration, and this method uses native application replication, mirroring or copying features to migrate data to clustered ONTAP. And the two key examples of application-based migration methods are Oracle Automatic Storage Management and the Microsoft Exchange Database Availability Groups. And virtualized environment tools for the movement of data are also grouped into this category for the purposes of transition. There is also an appliance-based migration, and this uses a piece of hardware, so you migrate the data into the GTA 2800, and then that will then migrate the data into a clustered environment. And you can also use host-based migration tools like rsync, NDMP copy, and your logical volume managers. So the first part is we need to discover the environment. So we need to look to discover the environment. We are looking at what applications we currently have and how they work, what are their respective workloads like, and their dependent storage requirements. Now we can define the business and the cutover requirements for each application and their workload. So the first step of the transition process, we need to understand what we have, how is it configured, and what is not working for you at present, and we need to document it. We're not looking to do an extensive documentation at this point, but anything you find when you're looking into the transition planning is document it, and that way it saves you having to repeat things later on. So the task of identifying your 7-mode environment may be a simple task, or it may require some cross-functional communication, depending on the size of the environment. If you've only got 1 or 2 storage systems running 7-mode, then it should be fairly straightforward. But if you're running a lot of systems, then you need to analyze each one of them in turn and decide which ones are more critical and which ones do I need to move across sooner rather than later. Some applications may be user orientated, in which case the priority may not be so high as the critical applications. So we need to do that type of assessment. So highly detailed technical discovery isn't necessary at this point. We're just gathering information. Anything you find, document it. It just saves looking for it later. But normally the business requirements will drive the decision as to what will move and by when. It may be over a process of time that you do your transition. Or it may be a case of we've got a free weekend and we want to get it all done in one hit. The business will decide. So if you've simply been told what is moving and to start planning, you'll not need to do a high level environment discovery, and you'll need to look at your transition planning. And part of that planning is a detailed technical discovery of your 7-mode configuration, the environment dependencies, applications, and clients. And using the 7-mode transition tool, that will actually help you, because within that there's a discovery tool that helps gather that information as part of the initial baseline so you understand what you've got. So you can then plan as to what you're going to end up with. So then we need to define the actual scope of the project. So we need to divide your 7-mode environment into one or more groups that can be moved to clustered ONTAP, and define a transition priority order for each group. For example, you may have Exchange, you may have SQL, you may have SharePoint. So what you'd look to do is gather all together your Exchange environment and put that as one group. Everything to do with your SQL environment, and maybe put that into a separate group. And so on and so on. And the idea will be that you put together these groups, and then you plan what you're going to transition, and in what order, and at what timing, based on the groups and how quickly you want to get them across. So defining the scope of the transition requires that you create a group of storage systems or applications or workloads that will move together. An example of this is if you have Exchange, for example, Exchange typically will have storage involved for the database and storage that's involved for the logs. And they tend to be different lungs or volumes in your environment. So we would look to group those together because you want to take the entire Exchange environment across in one hit. So the first approach would be to divide your 7-mode controllers and their workloads they're hosting, in the case of a controller level granularity. And each workload is normally contained within a single controller and not spread across multiple controllers or HA pairs. The second approach is to divide the environment by the application workloads or constituent groups that rely on the storage system. As a result, you may end up in a situation where you have both 7-mode and cluster modes running in parallel with each other while you do the transition process. So once you've discovered or established your grouping, it will be necessary to identify the order that the groupings will move in. Considerations for grouping systems should include the cutover requirements for the application workloads or storage systems, the placement of your dependent storage containers in the 7-mode system, and the system warranties and tech refresh schedules. So obviously, if you have a system that's due to run out of warranty, then that would be an ideal candidate to move across sooner rather than later, so that you don't end up in a position where you have a storage system that's no longer supported that has key critical application data on there. And we also need to look at the readiness of the storage system to move to clustered ONTAP. So it is a case of processing through, understanding what you've currently got, and making an informed decision as to what you want to move, when you want to move it, and how you want to move it. And that would lead you into planning your transition. So we'll map the 7-mode storage containers to their clustered ONTAP equivalents, perform a 7-mode feature assessment, so look at what features you currently use and make sure that they are licensed and still valid in a clustered environment. Identify the existing disaster recovery and backup relationships. Identify the migration methods for each storage container being moved. Identify the management applications and other operational dependencies requiring updates. And then update any scripts that you use in Zapier or the 7-mode commands. Because there is a difference between 7-mode and cluster mode commands. So you need to make sure you update those scripts so they will still work in a clustered environment for you. And then create a plan to provide clustered ONTAP training to administrators. If we go back to the analogy, if you know how to ride a bicycle, that's one thing. Understanding how to ride a unicycle takes a bit more work. But understanding how to run your cluster, you may have a lot of 7-mode experience, but it doesn't always mean that you get how cluster mode works. There's a lot of things that are very much different, and they're different because of how cluster mode works. Instead of being bound by the controller, we are now bound by the cluster itself. So we can do a volume move from one node to another node totally non-disruptively, even if it's part of a mirror or a vault relationship. We can move data around very easily, and that allows us to distribute the workload better. Or it could be that one of my nodes has got a problem, so we can migrate stuff away from it onto another node while we sort out the problem, but do it all non-disruptively. The whole idea of cluster mode is to give you an environment that is 24/7, non-disruptive, no matter what. So transition planning activities focused on documenting how you intend to move your 7-mode environment to cluster mode. And depending on the size of your 7-mode footprint, it may be straightforward or it may require some additional effort for a large environment. Although the majority of transition planning is about data migration, and there are considerations that must be addressed. So then we need to design the cluster. So we know what we've got, we know what we want, so we have to design the cluster in readiness for that transition process. So we specify the configuration elements that must be applied to the destination cluster. You access your 7-mode workload characterization and utilization, and then perform cluster sizing or headroom assessments, and then design your new cluster architecture or configuration changes to accommodate it. So the approach to cluster design is going to vary slightly based on whether you've already got a cluster in place that you're going to be migrating into, or whether you're actually going to be building a brand new cluster as part of the process. If the cluster's already there, it's a little bit simpler because you've already got the framework in place. So you just have to add in the extra bits that you need. If it's a new cluster, then it's a bit more effort and a bit more time to actually design the cluster itself to accommodate what your end result needs to be. So Outside of the transition-driven requirements, for example, workloads and storage containers being moved, the majority of this activity is not specific to transition and rather is generically applicable to any clustered ONTAP deployment. So we need to deploy and configure a new cluster to execute our configuration changes on a pre-existing cluster, test and verify your cluster configuration and off-box dependencies. So essentially, you're going to deploy the cluster and then configure the cluster as per the design that we've put together earlier on. And the activities that deploy and configure will vary depending on if the destination cluster to the transition activity is pre-existing or whether you're building a new one. And regardless of if the cluster is new or existing, it will be necessary to thoroughly test and validate data access and cluster operation is healthy. The last thing you want to do is migrate the data across, blow away the old system, and then find out that you've got something wrong or you've missed something. So it is really key that you do thorough testing and validate that all the users that need access to that data now have access before you kill the old system. So we now need to migrate the data. So we execute our data migrations and cutover activities. We verify the data access and execute a post-migration configuration. And the act of the data migration is one that is familiar to many customers. Depending on the migration method being used, the data migration may be disruptive or non-disruptive. So transition planning activities provide a migration method that will be used for each storage container being moved to clustered ONTAP, along with the cutover considerations and the timings associated with the method being used. So once we have gone through that migration process, we then may need to update our environment. So we need to update the management applications, the script dependencies. We obviously need to train the staff on the new environment, how it works and how they can use it, and then create new or update your existing environmental procedures to make sure that you have everything documented and everyone knows exactly what to do and how they can do it. So making sure the off-box environment dependencies are working once the transition workloads are operating in production is absolutely essential. It is reasonable to expect that for large environments, a priority order may be needed as to which off-box dependencies are more critical to address first. For example, updating on-command management products that are used to manage your cluster would be more critical than updating a simple maintenance script that needs to use the new clustered ONTAP commands. So we've gone through the process of looking at what we've currently got, then making an evaluation saying, do we need to move to cluster mode? If so, how are we going to do it? And if we decide that we're going to move to cluster mode, we then go through this transition fundamentals, where we look at identifying what we've got. Look at our current environment, define the scope. We then go through the design process of transition planning, the cluster design, and then we go through the implementation where we deploy and configure the system, we migrate the data across, and then update our environment to accommodate the new configuration we have. So now you've completed the transition. You have everything now working in a clustered environment. However, it doesn't stop here. Now that you've moved to the clustered environment, you need to then monitor your environment. Because they work so differently between 7 mode and cluster mode, you may find that your clustered environment may need a little bit of tweaking to get even more out of it that you never expected. So as time goes by, make adjustments to accommodate changes either within the organization or your applications. And once you've done all that, you'll then be running your environment in a clustered environment. You can then decommission your 7-mode systems or even recommission them into the cluster to extend the cluster that you've got. So this concludes this session. I hope that it's been useful to yourself. And if you bear with me, very shortly I'm going to open up to any questions. But thank you very much for your attendance. And if there's any questions, I'm going to open up to questions now. Okay, so I've just unmuted everybody. So, is there any questions from anyone, or any thoughts or suggestions? Okay, so has this session been of any use to you guys at all?
Yes, I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Any questions before we close the session down?
Not from me.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, thank you very much for your attendance. And as I said, I hope this has been useful to you. And if there's no questions, feel free to exit from the session. And thank you for your attendance. And we'll keep you informed if there's any updates or any other sessions coming across to you shortly.